Okay, so I'm going to be covering electronics.
Is it recording?
Yes, it's recording. So, a little introduction. There's two main configurations for electronics. There is a CTRE, cross-the-road electronics, and REV. REV just came out with configuration technically last year, but not during the season. But all of the, or most of the components we have are CTRE, which is like the older one, but it works just as good, even though the REV one is a little nicer. So I'm going to be talking to you guys about the CTRE layout. So this is just the whole diagram of everything. I'm not going to go into too much detail of exactly what plugs in where and how it plugs in, because that's kind of the point of this diagram. I'm going to just be explaining what those components do and how they function. So, but for some other basic information, positive is a red lead, is red, negative is black. CAN or PWM, if you ever hear those are data connections. CAN has to be wired a little bit differently. Like if you notice on the left side of this diagram, CAN, it's wiring from the RoboRio into the PCM, into each of the objects, and back into the PDP. I'll explain what I'm pointing at later. But with PWM, if you notice, it just plugs straight into the RoboRio. So CAN is a lot easier to wire manage, because that way not everything's plugging back into the same port. Like if you have worked with the VEX robots, it's kind of messy to have everything plug into one spot. This way they just plug into each other and you can manage things better. PWM also transmits less data, which is interesting because CAN has only two, a high and a low end, and PWM has like 3 different signals, which is weird, but CAN, so if you ever can use CAN over PWM, use CAN because you can get more data from the whatever you're working with better. And then gauge is just the thickness of the wire, so depending on how much current or how much voltage you're putting through to a device, you want to use a thinner cable or thicker cable. So, we're going to start from one side of the configuration, the battery and the breaker. So, obviously the robot needs power, so the battery is just a 12 volt that has 18 amp hours. The positive lead is led through this breaker, because if you notice, both leads don't plug into the breaker. That's because you don't need that. You only need to cut off one end of the lead to actually stop a current flow, because electronics has to flow in like a circle in a way. So the negative lead, or positive lead, sorry, plugs into the breaker, and that's how you connect and disconnect the robot's power. And then this is just a little bit of bonus information. At competition, if you guys notice this, we replace the battery after every match. That's because it wears on the battery, running the robot, running all those motors. It really drains that battery real quick.
Like the one that lit on fire.
Like the one that, yes, lit on fire.
Really
And all this plugs into the PDP. The PDP stands for Power Distribution Panel, and like in the name, it distributes power to all the to every single electronic in the robot. So there's like 8 large pairs of these little, I forgot what they're called. There's these connectors, I'm just going to call them, and 8 small pairs. The large pairs can take in 40 amp breakers, meaning that if the current becomes too high, if like a motor is sucking in too much power, it'll just cut power to the motor, because otherwise you could damage the motor or cause an explosion or all sorts of things. That's the point of those breakers, is to limit how much current flow there actually is going through it. 8 small pairs for smaller breakers. That way you can have just like tiny motors or smaller electronics. And if you look in the very back, you see those little white ports. Those are for a lot smaller, or not smaller electronics, low power electronics. And those 3 low power electronics are the Rio, the PCM, and the VRM, which I'll explain in a minute here. So, motors and motor controllers. So motors provide movement for the whole robot, whether that's like an arm mechanism, the chassis, whatever you're designing, you need a motor to kind of move everything. The motor controllers provide lots of allow you to control it, because otherwise the PDP just provides straight power. If you plug something into the PDP, it's going to get power. That's the kind of part of the point of the motor controllers, is to shut off the power, limit the power, all sorts of things like that. And these motor controllers can be controlled by PWM or CAN, depending on the motor controller and depending on what you're trying to do. The VRM and the PCM. So the VRM is a voltage regulator module. Basically, it's for anything that's also low power. So if you're going to have like lights or sensors, they'll usually get power from the VRM. The PCM provides power for everything pneumatic. So Simon's gonna go over the pneumatics part in a little bit here, but the pneumatics include like the compressor, the valves, and all the solenoids. It also transmits a little bit of data, which he'll explain in a minute here. And the VRM doesn't actually need to be controlled because like the PDP, it's just giving out power, so it's not actually hooked up to CAN. But the PCM is controlled by CAN because you don't have control over those pistons and solenoids. So the RoboRio, it has like the CPU. It's just think of it as the brain of the robot. That's the part you actually program. That's where most of your data, all of your data connections will go to. It's controlled by CAN. It's honestly pretty straightforward how it all works. There's different types of connections. Like if you notice here, these pins, most of these will be dealing with sensors or motor controllers, or wiring it up to CAN over there. But those three at the top, the biggest thing I'd say about them is for like cameras, talking to the radio, and downloading, and you can actually upload code from it, which you wouldn't really need to. And then the last major part I'll go over is the radio and the robot signal light. The radio is just basically like a small Wi-Fi router that plugs into the robot so you can connect to it and just talk to it wirelessly. And then the RSL tells you whether or not the robot's on, activated, or if it's actually moving. So it's off. Robot has no power. It's obviously disabled because it has no power. If it's on, but not blinking, that means the robot has power, but there's no code telling it to do anything. It's not trying to move. It's not trying to be controlled. And if it's blinking, that means the robot's on. That means someone can control it, or it's going to try to move because it's an autonomous, depending on what it's trying to do. And that's basically it. If you have any other like specific needs or were wondering like to find the wire diagrams or find more information about these parts, you can visit the documentation. That's just right there. Or you can just look up on the web FRC 2022 documentation, and you'll find all the information there about it. You guys have any questions about electronics?